What if the happiest place on Earth wasn't built for happiness at all? What if Disneyland was only the prototype for a world where streets, cities, even your daily choices are quietly engineered? Behind the magic lies a secret experiment, one that escaped the parks and rewrote how governments, militaries, and corporations control the masses. In the summer of 1955, Walt Disney stood on a stage in Anaheim, California, and introduced the world to something no one had ever seen before: Disneyland. It wasn't just a collection of rides and concessions. It was a world meticulously designed to feel alive. Every street, every storefront, every piece of music was carefully chosen to evoke a sense of wonder, control, and perfection. To the public, it was the happiest place on Earth. But behind the smiles, some observers saw something more calculated, a living prototype for something bigger. Walt himself described Disneyland not as a park, but as a model for what the future could look like. Disneyland opened to the roar of television cameras and cheering families, but almost immediately, journalists noticed something strange. Guests didn't simply wander, they were guided, subtly directed by layout, music, and design. Walt had consulted with military planners and urban designers. Main Street USA wasn't just nostalgia, it was a funnel, carefully channeling crowds toward the castle, which served as the central psychological anchor. Visitors felt free, but every step they took had already been anticipated. Walt believed people needed to be managed to experience joy, and Disneyland was the laboratory where he proved it could be done. Hidden loudspeakers broadcast subliminal instructions, scents were piped through vents to stir hunger and nostalgia, and even the trash cans were positioned according to behavioral studies. Families felt magic, but behind the curtain, what was happening looked very much like an experiment in mass psychology. What many people don't realize is that Walt's obsession with control went beyond Anaheim. Before he died, he spoke of Disneyland as a prototype. He envisioned entire cities run with the same precision, where residents would live inside systems designed to predict, influence, and perfect behavior. This idea would later resurface in EPCOT, but even in 1955, the foundation was already in place. To some, Disneyland wasn't just the beginning of themed entertainment. It was the first step in a project that, if rumors are true, never stopped expanding. And here's where the whispers of the Clone Project begin. Why, skeptics ask, did Walt insist on designing parks with the same blueprints? Disneyland in Anaheim, the Magic Kingdom in Florida, Tokyo Disneyland, they all share eerily similar layouts, as though following a secret master plan. It may seem innocent, but when you start to see Disneyland not as a theme park, but as a prototype for a controlled environment, the replication takes on a darker meaning. Was the original park only a draft, a testing ground for something that would later be duplicated in ways the public never knew existed? Disneyland's first day was plagued by chaos. Rides broke down, asphalt melted in the heat, and guests flooded in far beyond capacity. Yet Disney called it a success, not because everything worked, but because the system of control held. Despite the failures, people left believing they had touched magic. That belief, that ability to convince masses to see wonder even amid failure, was perhaps Walt's most powerful discovery. What followed in the decades after Disneyland's opening was a quiet expansion of not just parks, but influence. Walt was now not just an entertainer, but a man who had proven he could shape reality itself. Governments noticed, corporations noticed, and behind closed doors, discussions began about how Disneyland could serve as more than a park, how it could become a prototype for managing society. It is here that the seeds of the Disneyland Clone Project were planted, in the moment when the world mistook entertainment for innocence, and when one man's dream of control became too powerful to ignore. When Disneyland opened in 1955, skeptics believed it was a one-of-a-kind marvel that would never be duplicated. But within a decade, plans were already underway to build its twin. In 1971, Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom opened in Florida, a park that, on the surface, looked like a bigger, brighter, and more modern version of Anaheim's original. Yet when compared closely, something striking became apparent. the layout was almost identical. Main Street, the central hub, the castle, the surrounding lands. It was as if the California park had been cloned, expanded, and transplanted across the country. To the public, it made sense. Disneyland was a success. Why not repeat the formula? But for those who studied the details, the precision was unsettling. Why reproduce not just the concepts, but the geography, the exact arrangement of paths, sightlines, and even the angles at which guests encounter attractions? It suggested that Disneyland wasn't merely entertainment. It was a blueprint being refined, a pattern too exact to be accidental. Walt Disney himself had always dreamed of building a much larger project in Florida, something beyond a park. In his vision, it would be an entire experimental city, EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. The Magic Kingdom, then, may not have been built simply as a theme park, but as the second laboratory, a larger clone of the first, designed to study crowd management on an even grander scale. When Tokyo Disneyland opened in 1983, the suspicions deepened. Japanese media noted that it looked eerily like Anaheim, same castle, same hub-and-spoke pattern, same emotional manipulations hidden in design. It was uncanny, as though Disney had stamped its design onto new soil with military precision. And yet, Tokyo's park wasn't even owned by Disney. It was licensed to a Japanese corporation. Why then insist that the layout match Anaheim nearly line for line? Over the years, clones appeared in Paris, Hong Kong, Shanghai. Each time, Disney explained the similarity as brand consistency, a way of making sure guests knew what to expect. But the exactness goes beyond branding. Why must every guest, regardless of country, be funneled down Main Street toward a castle into lands carefully arranged around a hub? If this were just entertainment, there would be room for creative variety. Instead, the design repeats with machine-like regularity. Conspiracy theorists began to whisper that the Disneyland clone project wasn't about tourism at all. Instead, it was about creating controlled environments across the world, replicas of Anaheim's prototype, designed to gather data on how humans behave in tightly constructed realities. Each park, with its cameras, sensors, and carefully designed flows, became not just a destination, but an experiment. Different cultures, same design. How do people respond? What changes and what stays the same? The implications were staggering. Imagine for a moment that Disneyland was never intended to remain unique, that Walt's dream of expansion was never about spreading joy, but about spreading control, turning theme parks into laboratories where millions unknowingly became test subjects. The smiles, the fireworks, the parades, they were the cover. Beneath it all, a global project was unfolding. One park, replicated again and again, until the world itself was mapped and measured by a formula designed in Anaheim. The happiest place on Earth wasn't being copied, it was being cloned. And the question that lingers is simple: how many clones exist that we've never been allowed to see? When Walt Disney died in 1966, his greatest project remained unfinished. It wasn't another castle, another park, or even another Main Street. It was something far more ambitious, something he called the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. To the public, the acronym became EPCOT, a futuristic city designed to showcase innovation. But to those who've studied Disney's private notes, EPCOT was never just a tourist attraction. It was a plan to build a real, functioning city where every detail of life was designed, monitored, and controlled. Walt described EPCOT as a living blueprint of the future. In his vision, 20,000 people would live there permanently. They wouldn't own their homes, the Disney company would. Residents wouldn't drive their own cars. Transportation would be controlled by automated systems. Even the weather could be influenced by giant domes and carefully engineered landscapes. Walt wanted EPCOT to be a city that never aged, never declined, and never changed without corporate approval. To some, it sounded like utopia. To others, dystopia. But the most disturbing element wasn't the architecture or the technology. It was the philosophy. Walt believed EPCOT would be an environment where human behavior could be studied, shaped, and perfected, Just as Disneyland's layout controlled crowds without them realizing it, EPCOT would control an entire society. Cameras, sensors, data, all the tools of urban management decades before smart cities became a reality. Epcot wasn't about progress, it was about experiment. After Walt's death, the company scaled EPCOT back into a theme park. The residential city was abandoned. At least, that's what the public was told. But deep within Disney archives lie documents hinting that elements of the original city plan were quietly tested elsewhere. Controlled environments, population studies, and data-driven urban layouts began to appear across other projects. Some researchers believe PCOT was simply folded into the broader Disneyland clone project, the idea that the parks themselves weren't just entertainment, but prototypes for entire controlled societies. What's unsettling is how EPCOT's philosophies mirrored Cold War experiments of the time. Government think tanks were also designing model cities for testing social behavior. Military planners studied controlled environments for psychological influence. And here was Walt Disney, an entertainment mogul, working on nearly identical concepts, funded by the wealth and secrecy of his empire. Was Epcot truly just a dream cut short, or was it a glimpse into a deeper collaboration between Disney and shadowy forces of the era? Today, EPCOT exists as a theme park. Guests wander through pavilions showcasing technology, global culture, and imagination. But some believe this is only the sanitized version. The real Epcot, the city Walt envisioned, was never scrapped, merely hidden. Perhaps a prototype was built in secrecy. Perhaps pieces of it were folded into the design of other parks. And perhaps the clone parks around the world are not just about rides and castles, but about rehearsing the systems Walt intended to scale to society itself. In the grand story of Disneyland and its clones, EPCOT is the missing link. The part that reveals Walt's true ambition wasn't to entertain the world, it was to redesign it. And if the clone project exists, then EPCOT wasn't abandoned at all. It was simply reclassified. By the mid-1960s, the rumors surrounding Walt Disney's global ambitions had grown louder. Officially, the company was focused on Disneyland in California and the still-developing Walt Disney World in Florida. But behind closed doors, discussions swirled of something stranger, a blueprint for replication. According to declassified papers and oral testimonies, Disney executives had entered into discreet conversations with US defense contractors and even international partners about controlled cultural installations. The premise was simple yet chilling. If Disneyland could shape public imagination in Anaheim, why couldn't it be weaponized elsewhere? What better way to influence global perception, to test behavioral responses, than by recreating environments of comfort, fantasy, and control? Evidence trickled out in fragments. A memo from 1965, discovered in an archive once tied to the Rand Corporation, references entertainment platforms meant for psychosocial field deployment. While never explicitly naming Disney, the language mirrored descriptions of fantasy parks that bore uncanny resemblance to Anaheim's flagship. Around the same time, construction photographs surfaced of a mysterious facility in Nevada, a near-identical replica of Disneyland's Main Street, but stripped of decoration and life. Former contractors recall it as eerily empty, like a movie set with no script. Eyewitnesses claim this clone park wasn't meant for the public at all. Instead, it was used to observe subjects in controlled environments. Volunteers, some say prisoners, others whisper test subjects from psychiatric hospitals, were guided through fabricated lands, while military psychologists recorded everything: their gaze, their choices, their stress responses to sound and architecture. The project seemed to blend Cold War paranoia with psychological experimentation. Just as the US tested nuclear weapons in remote deserts, here it tested cultural weapons, soft power camouflaged as amusement. Some historians argue the purpose was to create environments for diplomacy, subtle indoctrination, or even as training grounds for foreign operatives who would later encounter Disneyland-style spaces abroad. Others pushed the theory further, that these clones were prototypes for underground continuity of government facilities, designed to keep American culture alive in case of catastrophe. What unsettles researchers most is how neatly the timeline aligns with Disney's expansion overseas. While the company publicly announced plans for Tokyo Disneyland in the 1970s, there were whispers that an experimental park had already been erected, not in Japan, but in a classified zone in the Pacific. No tickets, no rides, just silence, cameras, and the hum of hidden machinery. The Disneyland clone project was more than urban legend. It was a shadow blueprint for how entertainment could double as social engineering. And though much of the documentation has been redacted, one question remains: how many clones were built, and how many still stand hidden in deserts, islands, or bunkers where laughter was never meant to be heard? By the early 1970s, whispers of the clone project began leaking out, not through official documents, but through the men and women who had built it. Retired contractors, engineers, and even janitors carried fragments of memory they couldn't shake. Some spoke of working on a desert site that looked like Disneyland but had no laughter. Others described moving crates of animatronics into warehouses where no children were ever meant to see them perform. To most, these were just stories, the kind that surface in dimly lit bars where veterans of classified projects meet and talk. But when the pieces were assembled, a darker picture emerged. Among the most unsettling accounts was that of a former electrician named Harold Klein. He claimed to have wired an underground complex beneath what appeared to be a harmless movie set. The surface resembled Disneyland's cheerful streets, but below, hidden corridors stretched for miles, filled with observation rooms, barracks, and strange laboratories humming with machines. Klein swore that the facility wasn't just about studying human reactions, it was about programming them. He recalled entire chambers lined with speakers and mirrored walls, designed to bombard test subjects with sounds, colours, and looping imagery from the parks above. The 1970s also saw the first rumours of offshore installations. Sailors stationed in the Pacific spoke of sailing past islands where they spotted familiar silhouettes, turrets resembling Sleeping Beauty Castle, towers that mimicked Tomorrowland's futuristic spires. But when they approached, they were ordered to turn away by patrol boats flying no flag. Those who pressed further often vanished from their posts or were reassigned suddenly, their service records classified. It is here that the clone project shifted from an experiment in psychology to something more ominous, a program of cultural conditioning. According to a 1974 Senate oversight transcript, later leaked in fragments, the government discussed controlled fantasy environments for overseas adaptation. This line, vague as it was, raised alarms among conspiracy researchers. Could it be that entire populations were being tested, subtly influenced, and trained to embrace Western values through artificial replicas of Disneyland? At the same time, public-facing Disney expanded in predictable ways. Florida's Walt Disney World opened in 1971, celebrated as the crown jewel of the company's legacy. But skeptics point to eerie overlaps. While Florida's Magic Kingdom was heralded as the happiest place on Earth, its layout mirrored what whistleblowers claimed existed in desert bunkers. Nearly identical streets, centralized castles, and underground tunnels known as utilidors. To the public, they were simple utility corridors. To those familiar with the clone project, they were a sanitized version of something far more secret. Perhaps the most chilling element was the suggestion that these clone parks weren't abandoned after testing. They remained operational. Some researchers insist that to this day, there are hidden parks where subjects are brought not for fun, but for study. Places where every movement is logged, every word recorded, every choice measured against data points gathered decades earlier. The 1970s left behind a trail of unsettling coincidences, redacted memos, and testimony that blurred the line between fantasy and manipulation. What is undeniable is that the clone project was expanding. From deserts to islands, from basements to overseas, the parks multiplied like reflections in a mirror, and in each mirror there was no child's laughter, only the quiet hum of a machine learning how to control the human mind. By the late 1970s, the clone project had evolved from rumor into a hidden infrastructure, one that few outsiders could even imagine. Where once there were whispers of secret desert towns and half-built castles on remote islands, now came reports of entire training programs conducted within these surreal environments. If the early stages of the project had been about observing natural reactions to fabricated spaces, this new era was about shaping behavior with precision. Former contractors described underground chambers designed to replicate Disneyland's rides but stripped of their joy. In place of music and laughter, the rooms pulsed with low-frequency tones, flickering lights and hypnotic imagery projected on the walls. Some swore that animatronics were deployed not to entertain but to unsettle, moving in stilted rhythms, repeating the same phrases again and again, as though testing the limits of human endurance. One chilling report from a medical technician claimed that subjects would be kept in these environments for days, forced to cycle through artificial lands without rest, while psychologists tracked their breaking points. Even more disturbing were claims of identity manipulation. Rumors suggest that the parks weren't only designed to control emotions, but to rewrite them. Test subjects allegedly underwent staged scenarios in which they were greeted by actors posing as family members, or confronted with doppelgangers of themselves recorded on hidden cameras. Imagine walking into an attraction only to see yourself, projected on a screen, repeating your words in real time, or an animatronic echoing your voice. These simulations, whether myth or truth, fed into the growing fear that the clone project had become an experiment in erasing individuality itself. At the same time, Disney as a corporation began introducing more sophisticated technologies into its public parks. Audio animatronics advanced dramatically, allowing for lifelike movements and synchronized voices. But to conspiracy researchers, this was no innocent coincidence. It was a sanitization of methods already tested in the clone facilities. Every smile you see in the parks, one whistleblower remarked, was perfected in a darker place first. The geopolitical climate also fueled suspicion. With the Cold War intensifying, cultural influence became as valuable as missiles. If Disneyland was the ultimate symbol of American optimism, its clones were the weaponized version of that dream. Reports circulated of Soviet spies infiltrating clone facilities in an attempt to reverse engineer the psychological tools hidden within. Meanwhile, fragments of US intelligence hinted that these parks might serve as training grounds for operatives, teaching them to navigate environments of deception where nothing was as it seemed. By 1979, a handful of journalists had begun to circle the story, though most were silenced or discredited. One particularly brave reporter claimed to have photographs of an underground park, with images of empty rides rotting in fluorescent-lit chambers. Before the photos could be published, the journalist disappeared, leaving only a single note: "The rides never stop." Not down there, the clone project had reached its most dangerous phase. No longer about testing fantasies, it had become a machinery for bending reality itself. For those who believe the testimonies, the scariest truth is this: the experiments didn't end. They simply went deeper underground, hidden beneath layers of secrecy, waiting for the next wave of subjects to arrive. As the clone project entered the 1980s, the boundaries between fiction and reality blurred even further. What had once been a hidden network of experimental parks was now rumored to extend across continents, each installation fine-tuned for a specific purpose. Some were said to test fear, others nostalgia, and still others obedience. Together, they formed a lattice of environments where human behavior could be mapped, manipulated, and recorded with frightening precision. A particularly persistent rumor centered on a facility deep in Eastern Europe, allegedly constructed during a period of covert cooperation between Western intelligence and defectors. The park, if it existed, was not for children, but for entire communities. Eyewitnesses spoke of villages suddenly relocated, their new homes designed with uncanny resemblance to Disneyland's idealized streets. But unlike Anaheim's pastel facades, these were grey, sterile, and rigged with cameras hidden in every lamppost. Children played, families ate, neighbors talked, all under the watchful eye of psychologists studying how quickly humans adapted to controlled illusions. At the same time, advancements in technology gave the clone project new tools. The rise of computers allowed behavior to be quantified like never before. Terminals were said to line underground bunkers, each screen filled with graphs mapping subjects' heart rates, eye movements, and even brainwave activity. Former technicians described feedback loops where subjects' responses would alter the environment in real time. Lighting would shift, music would stop, or animatronics would move closer depending on how an individual reacted. It was no longer about simple observation, it was about dynamic conditioning. Disney's public-facing parks, meanwhile, grew into global icons. Epcot opened in 1982, a celebration of technology and world culture. But conspiracy researchers saw shadows lurking in its utopian vision. EPCOT's experimental community of tomorrow echoed too closely the sealed communities rumoured in clone facilities. The sanitized, cheerful version offered to paying guests seemed to mirror darker prototypes hidden away. The difference between the park and the project, one anonymous source said, was that in EPCOT you could leave. In the clones you stayed until they decided you were finished. One of the most haunting accounts came from a woman who claimed to have been a subject in the Nevada facility as a child. In a rare interview decades later, she described walking through a park that looked like Disneyland but with no crowds. The rides worked, but no one laughed, she recalled. The characters looked at me too long. And when I called out, my voice echoed back, but it wasn't my voice anymore. Whether this was trauma, hallucination, or memory is impossible to say, but it aligned disturbingly well with other testimonies. The 1980s solidified the Clone Project's mythology. For some, it was proof of American ingenuity taken to its logical extreme, a belief that fantasy itself could be harnessed as a tool of control. For others, it was madness, the idea that the very symbols of childhood joy could be twisted into psychological laboratories. The chilling part is this. Many of the clone parks were said to be still operational, their technology upgraded with each decade. If this is true, then somewhere, right now, people may be walking through a Disneyland where every step, every glance, every word is logged, not for entertainment, but for control. By the mid-1980s, the Clone Project had become more than an experiment. It had grown into a machine that no one seemed able to stop. The Cold War had reached a fever pitch, and both sides were desperate for ways to influence not only armies, but entire populations. Disneyland was no longer just an amusement park. It had become the perfect metaphor for a controlled environment where people willingly gave themselves over to fantasy. The clones took that metaphor and weaponized it. Leaked reports from this period suggest that the project had entered its simulation phase. Instead of simply observing subjects in pre-built environments, engineers began experimenting with full-scale rehearsals of society itself. Imagine entire communities built to look like utopian suburbs, complete with shopping centres, schools, and fake news broadcasts, all carefully crafted to maintain the illusion of normal life. Hidden behind those facades were networks of cameras, microphones, and biometric trackers. People living in these controlled communities never knew they were test subjects. To them, it was just life. But every decision, every purchase, every conversation was logged, catalogued, and analysed. One particularly disturbing file describes a project codenamed Fantasyland Echo. It detailed the construction of a sealed dome environment in Nevada, where hundreds of residents lived under the impression they were part of a futuristic housing experiment. In reality, psychologists controlled everything: when the sun rose and set, what food appeared in stores, even what rumors spread through the community. At night, echoes of Disneyland music would drift faintly through hidden speakers, mixing with subliminal tones. Researchers measured how these subtle manipulations changed behavior, mood, and even memory. Meanwhile, Disney's public expansion accelerated. Tokyo Disneyland opened in 1983, a global milestone celebrated as proof of the company's international reach. Yet the Clone Project's critics noted unsettling parallels. Just as the Japanese public embraced the carefully replicated Anaheim experience, whispers suggested that an earlier, classified training park had been tested in Asia, closed to the public, but used to measure how non-Western populations responded to Disney's brand of fantasy. The rise of video technology added another layer. Surveillance within the clone parks became more advanced, with every angle covered by cameras feeding into massive storage facilities. Some insiders claimed that a digital mirror archive of human behavior was being built, cataloguing reactions to joy, fear, confusion, and control. If true, this would mean the project wasn't just about influencing the present, but about stockpiling data to predict the future. By the end of the decade, stories of people vanishing near test sites became harder to ignore. Families reported loved ones who took jobs with construction crews or maintenance teams for secret projects and never came back. Official records listed them as missing, but conspiracy researchers suspected they had become permanent residents of the clone environments. Trapped in artificial worlds, their existence scrubbed from reality. The 1980s were the moment when the clone project crossed an invisible line. It stopped being an experiment and became a parallel reality, hidden just out of reach. And the scariest part, no one outside the project could say how many of these communities existed or whether they had ever truly ended. By the mid-1970s, whispers of something uncanny began to leak from behind closed doors. Journalists on both coasts had caught wind of construction projects that didn't appear on any official Disneyland map. Reporters claimed to have seen scaled-down rides in warehouses, half-finished castles in desert testing ranges, and even ride operators rehearsing on sets that were never meant for the public eye. The story was tantalizing but unstable. Without photos, it was just another urban myth. But soon, anomalies began surfacing within Disneyland itself. Visitors swore that rides they had known since childhood were subtly different, animatronics with unfamiliar faces, walkways that twisted in directions they didn't before, and entire corners of the park that felt like echoes of places they had already walked through minutes earlier. What unnerved people most wasn't what they saw, but what they heard. Echoes of laughter that didn't match the crowd around them. Announcements over loudspeakers in voices that were slightly off, as though an imitation of the real thing. Families reported being separated and later reuniting, only to find that their children claimed to have spoken with a cast member in a uniform that no one else remembered. When questioned, Disneyland management dismissed it all as imagination, nostalgia, confusing memory. But a paper trail told a different story. Declassified procurement records showed massive shipments of materials, steel, plaster, hydraulics, fabrics, all routed to subdivisions of the Walt Disney Company with no listed address. Internal memos referenced prototype environments and duplicate operational units. By now, conspiracy researchers were certain Disneyland was more than a theme park. It was a template, a mold being tested and replicated. But where? Why? What no one outside the circle knew at the time was that the US government itself had become interested. Disneyland's efficient crowd management, advanced animatronics, and subtle psychological conditioning of guests were studied as a model for something much bigger. For military planners, it wasn't about amusement, it was about control. If people could be guided, distracted, and entertained into compliance in a theme park, what else could be done in cities, in nations, in times of crisis? And so, the Disneyland Clone Project shifted from myth to classified reality. Journalists who pursued the trail too aggressively often found their careers derailed, their articles killed at the last minute. Some even swore that counterfeit parks existed in remote corners of the US, where rides stood silent, never meant to entertain anyone except the researchers who observed how environments shaped human behavior. The truth was beginning to claw its way into public awareness, and the company was desperate to keep it hidden. But the problem with building clones is that sometimes they start to bleed into the real. Guests were reporting things that management could no longer wave away. Something had escaped containment, and the line between Disneyland as a park and Disneyland as an experiment was vanishing. By the late 1970s, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. The Disneyland Clone Project had attracted not just fringe theorists, but also the attention of institutions with far more resources than any journalist could wield. The US government, already fascinated with behavioral studies during the Cold War, saw in Disney's parks a functioning laboratory. It wasn't about rides or castles anymore, it was about human engineering. How do you move tens of thousands of people through confined spaces without panic? How do you direct attention away from security personnel? How do you create an environment where every visitor is willing to follow rules without ever questioning them? Disneyland had perfected all of it. Former employees later admitted that federal agents would visit the park disguised as tourists, carrying notebooks instead of cameras. They mapped crowd flows, noted how families unconsciously followed Disney signage, and studied how music and lighting subtly influenced behavior. The reports that emerged concluded something astonishing. Disneyland was a civilian obedience simulator, a place where architecture, entertainment, and psychology merged to create compliance without force. But the project didn't stop with observations. Secret partnerships funneled millions into Disney's infrastructure research, money that never appeared in annual reports. Entire sections of the park, sometimes just a single attraction, sometimes entire zones, were quietly shut down, reworked, and then reopened with subtle changes. The goal was to measure how these changes influenced guest behavior. If a pathway was narrowed, would families cluster differently? If lighting was dimmed in a specific ride, would guests move faster without realizing why? Even the scent of food stalls was tested, engineered aromas drifting across walkways to influence where crowds gathered. The experiments weren't confined to Anaheim. Whispers circulated that mirror parks existed on restricted government land, exact replicas of Disneyland rides, but without the guests. Instead, these versions were filled with volunteers, military recruits, or even unwitting test subjects. Here, variables could be pushed to extremes without public backlash. Imagine being dropped into a Disney-like environment where the cheerful music was slightly off-key, where rides looped endlessly without exit, where cast members gave instructions that contradicted each other, and all of it was meticulously recorded. These were not parks of joy, but parks of data. For officials, the Disneyland Clone Project offered something priceless, a model for social control. Cities could be designed with the same techniques. Crowds at protests could be manipulated using subtle architectural cues. Even prisons and military bases could adopt the illusion of freedom that Disney perfected, an environment where the choices felt endless, but the path was always predetermined. And yet, the secrecy was not perfect. Maintenance workers sometimes stumbled onto areas they weren't supposed to see, underground tunnels with unfamiliar layouts, rides that were duplicated in warehouses, entire staging areas hidden beneath construction tarps. Some spoke out, only to find themselves silenced, fired, blacklisted, or worse. A few brave ones managed to leak documents, suggesting that these experiments had already crossed into the public space. Guests were already test subjects. Every step through Disneyland was both entertainment and experiment. What began as a theme park was now a proving ground for something far more sinister. The line between leisure and control was dissolving, and as the Clone Project expanded, so too did the chilling question. If the government could perfect obedience in Disneyland, where else might they be building their clones? By the early 1980s, the Disneyland Clone Project had quietly shifted from a purely American experiment into an international phenomenon. What began as a US government corporate partnership was now drawing attention from foreign powers. Disney's global expansion, Tokyo Disneyland in 1983 being the first international park, was marketed as entertainment diplomacy, but within classified circles it was regarded as a calculated move. Tokyo was not simply chosen for commercial reasons, it was the perfect test site for exporting the Clone Project's methods abroad. From the outside, the Japanese public saw only the glittering opening ceremonies, the smiling Mickey Mouse waving in a new cultural bridge between East and West. But behind the curtain, Tokyo Disneyland was meticulously observed. Teams of psychologists and sociologists, many with quiet ties to American intelligence agencies, measured how Japanese guests moved, reacted, and complied within the park's carefully engineered environments. How did crowd dynamics differ from Anaheim? Would signage in Japanese prompt the same unconscious obedience? Would local culture resist or embrace the Disney-designed flow of movement and attention? The findings startled even the architects of the project. Despite cultural differences, the mechanisms worked. Crowds in Tokyo followed the same behavioral patterns as those in California. Pathways guided them, music entranced them, lighting and scent lured them. The conclusion was chilling. Disney's formula for engineered obedience was not bound by national borders. Human psychology was the same everywhere, and the Clone Project had just gone global. Foreign governments took notice. It wasn't long before Soviet analysts, already obsessed with American cultural influence, began dissecting Disneyland as a model for mass behavior manipulation. Declassified Soviet documents later revealed that researchers in Moscow built crude mock-ups of Disney rides in secret facilities, not for fun, but to study how Western entertainment could quietly program compliance. Meanwhile, in Europe, whispers suggested that NATO intelligence agencies studied Euro Disneyland's planning long before its eventual 1992 debut, curious about whether a park could function as both cultural export and behavioral experiment on European soil. And then came the darker turn. If Disneyland's design principles could be replicated internationally, why stop at amusement parks? Urban planners, under quiet contracts with government agencies, began incorporating similar designs into airports, shopping malls, and even public plazas. Subtle changes, like how signage directed foot traffic, how seating areas clustered groups, how colours influenced moods, were all rooted in lessons first perfected inside Disneyland. The Clone Project was bleeding into everyday life. Former Disney Imagineers, who defected from the company in the 1980s, confirmed what conspiracy researchers suspected. The company was no longer just building parks. It was building prototypes for the future of cities. They described classified meetings in which Disney executives and government officials discussed urban simulation environments. These were not meant to entertain but to control, teaching populations how to move, how to wait, how to obey. Tokyo Disneyland's success was the proof of concept. Euro Disneyland would extend the experiment, and insiders whispered of proposals for clone parks not open to the public at all, entire hidden sites in Asia, the Middle East and Eastern Europe, where obedience could be tested on controlled groups without any smiling mouse in sight. What began as a single park in California was now an international web of influence. The Clone Project had crossed borders, and with each new expansion came a new question. Were guests enjoying themselves, or were they unknowingly playing their part in the largest behavioral experiment ever conducted on humanity? By the dawn of the 1990s, the Clone Project had matured beyond whispers and hidden warehouses. Its next stage unfolded in plain sight under the name Euro Disneyland. Located just outside Paris, the park was presented to the world as a bold expansion of the Disney empire. To most, it was a symbol of American cultural reach, the magic of Mickey transplanted into the heart of Europe. But within the project's inner circles, Euro Disneyland was something else entirely. It was a continental-scale experiment. From the earliest planning phases, the park was engineered not just as an attraction, but as a testing ground. French newspapers at the time reported on labour disputes, cultural clashes, and spiralling costs. But few realised that these conflicts were themselves being observed. Internal documents later revealed that project backers, including both Disney executives and silent government partners, wanted to see how European populations would react to Disney's model of controlled leisure. Would Parisians, notorious for resisting authority, submit to the same subtle psychological cues that worked so effectively in California and Tokyo? Would European guests fall into the same carefully designed pathways, or would they rebel against the manufactured order? The answers were unsettling. When Euro Disneyland opened in 1992, the media mocked it as a cultural failure. Attendance was lower than expected, debts mounted, and critics called it a cultural Chernobyl. But beneath the ridicule, the Clone Project's observers gathered invaluable data. They learned that while Europeans initially resisted the overt commercialization, the underlying architecture still shaped their movements. Guests still clustered in predictable ways. Children still responded to Disney's stimuli. Families still followed the flow without realizing they were being directed. But there were anomalies. Reports emerged of echo spaces within the park, areas where visitors swore they had déjà vu, walking the same streets multiple times even though the layout was different. Others described meeting cast members who vanished moments later, or noticing attractions that seemed to shift slightly between visits. Employees spoke quietly about shadow rehearsals, duplicate parades that occurred late at night when no guests were present, as though the park itself was training for something unseen. Even the park's financial crisis had its uses. The Clone Project's researchers documented how negative press altered crowd psychology, how scarcity of visitors changed the flow, and how desperation among staff created new behavioural patterns. Euro Disneyland was not a failure, it was a laboratory. And then came the darkest revelation. French contractors hired during construction swore they had built more than what the public ever saw. Beneath the visible park, entire sublevels existed, tunnels, staging areas, and rooms sealed off from staff. Some claim there were sections of the underground city that didn't connect to known maps, chambers filled with unfinished rides, or entire duplicate sets built but never opened. Officially, these were logistics corridors. Unofficially, they were parallel environments, spaces designed for controlled experiments outside the public eye. For the French public, Euro Disneyland was a curiosity, a flawed but glittering attempt to transplant American magic. For the Clone Project, it was a milestone. The data confirmed what they had long suspected. Resistance was cultural, but behaviour was universal. With the right architecture, sound, and flow, even the proudest societies could be guided without ever realising it. Euro Disneyland had proved the formula worked anywhere, and if it worked in Paris, it could work everywhere. The official maps of Euro Disneyland in the 1990s showed only a wonderland of rides and attractions above ground. Families strolled through Main Street, gazed at Sleeping Beauty's castle, and cheered as parades passed by. But beneath their feet, another Disneyland existed, one that was never meant for the public. Known euphemistically as the Utilidors, the underground network was described by Disney as a practical system for staff to move unseen, for trash disposal, and for logistics. Yet workers who ventured too deep swore there was more. At first, the tunnels seemed ordinary enough, concrete corridors with fluorescent lights, pipes rattling, carts carrying food or costumes. But then there were the sealed doors. Entire sections of the underground city were locked and unmarked, guarded not by Disney security but by men who did not wear uniforms at all. Maintenance crews who stumbled into these areas described long hallways that seemed to stretch beyond the footprint of the park above. Some reported vast chambers filled with ride parts, duplicate animatronics of familiar characters, but with subtle differences. Faces slightly wrong, voices distorted, movements too sharp. Others claimed there were entire rooms built to mimic the streets above ground, but empty, lifeless, like ghost copies of Main Street. One former contractor recalled being asked to install ventilation in a chamber that, according to the blueprints, shouldn't have existed. When he pressed for details, his supervisor told him to stop asking questions. Days later, he was reassigned and never permitted back into the sublevel. He described the chamber as a copy of Disneyland at half scale, with blank-faced figures frozen mid-stride, like the park was rehearsing without people. The secrecy around these areas sparked rumours that Euro Disneyland's underground levels were not just for operations, but for experiments. Some employees whispered about parallel environments, duplicate rides tested in isolation. Here, engineers could alter the timing, the music, even the structure itself, and then compare it with guest behaviour above ground. In effect, the park existed twice, once for the public and once for the project. Stranger still were reports of echo incidents. Workers claimed they sometimes heard music playing in sealed corridors when no speakers were installed, or laughter echoing from empty rooms. A few even admitted they saw themselves, or something that looked like themselves, walking in the distance before vanishing behind a corner. These stories were dismissed as exhaustion, the result of long shifts underground. But the stories never stopped. The deeper you went, the more it seemed the underground Disneyland was not simply logistics, but a mirror, a shadow version, a clone beneath the clone. And this raised a terrifying question. If the project was building duplicate spaces in Europe, how many other hidden environments already existed worldwide, invisible beneath the places we thought we knew? For most visitors, Euro Disneyland was a flawed dreamland that slowly grew into acceptance. But for those who worked in the underground, it was a labyrinth of secrets. The happiest place on Earth had a double life, one sealed away in concrete and silence. And if the Clone Project had mastered building hidden parks beneath the ground, then perhaps the real experiment was not about entertainment at all, it was about duplicating reality itself. By the mid-1990s, the underground labyrinth beneath Euro Disneyland had become more than a corporate secret. It was now entangled with government research. French intelligence agencies, already wary of the park's cultural influence, quietly entered into agreements with Disney executives to use portions of the subterranean space for psychological studies. On paper, these were described as visitor flow evaluations and infrastructure efficiency assessments. In reality, they were controlled experiments in mass behavior. Leaked documents suggested that entire sections of the underground levels were transformed into observation chambers. Small groups of participants, sometimes volunteers recruited under the guise of cast member training, other times unsuspecting maintenance workers, were guided through artificial environments. These spaces mirrored the park above, but were subtly altered. Pathways narrowed or widened, music played at irregular tempos, signs pointed in conflicting directions. The goal was simple: to observe how people responded to stress, confusion, and authority when wrapped in the comforting disguise of Disney's design. Reports indicated that European governments were particularly interested in how Disneyland's techniques could be adapted to urban environments. If guests could be directed through fabricated pathways in a park, could citizens be managed in city centres during emergencies? If carefully designed music and lighting could soothe frustrated families in line, could the same principles disperse political protests without violence? The Clone Project had shifted from amusement to governance. Some of the most chilling revelations came from testimonies of workers assigned to midnight studies. These exercises took place after the park closed, with groups of test subjects led underground and immersed in manipulated scenarios. One worker recalled guiding a small group into a replica of Main Street where the exits were deliberately blocked. For hours, the subjects wandered in circles while researchers observed how long it would take for panic to set in. Strangely, most never panicked. The familiar Disney design seemed to calm them, even as they realized they were trapped. European military observers took notice. By the late 1990s, there were rumors of training modules developed directly from Disneyland's research. Police academies experimented with environmental control strategies, using staged spaces to train officers in crowd management. Some even whispered that NATO had received access to Clone Project data, incorporating it into contingency plans for civil unrest. And yet, perhaps the most disturbing element was how invisible it all remained. To millions of tourists, Euro Disneyland was just a troubled theme park struggling to find its footing. But beneath the laughter and fireworks, governments were conducting experiments on how to reshape society itself. The underground clone spaces had become laboratories where the future of psychological control was quietly written. What began as a corporate dream had merged with state power. Disney's architecture of obedience was no longer just a park strategy, it was becoming a blueprint for governance. And if Europe had embraced it so quickly, one had to wonder how many other governments across the globe were already building their own versions of the Clone Project. By the dawn of the new millennium, the Clone Project had escaped the confines of Euro Disneyland's underground. What began as a corporate experiment in visitor management had been quietly absorbed into Europe's defense infrastructure. NATO, already exploring unconventional strategies for crowd control and psychological warfare, found the park's data to be a goldmine. Disney's engineers had perfected techniques for controlling large groups of people without force, subtle music shifts, architectural illusions, lighting tricks, even scent dispersal. For NATO planners, these weren't just amusement park novelties, they were tools that could be deployed in real-world crises. If a park could funnel 50,000 people through a parade route with no panic, then surely a city centre could be managed during a protest, an evacuation, or even a coup. Declassified fragments, leaked years later, revealed that military training manuals began borrowing directly from the Clone Project. Soldiers and police officers were introduced to concepts like environmental pacification zones, a sterile term for spaces engineered to manipulate human behaviour. Instructors showed recruits how something as simple as narrowing a street or changing the tempo of background noise could diffuse tension or provoke compliance. The integration didn't stop there. By 2002, NATO had commissioned experimental drills in undisclosed European bases where soldiers were exposed to Disney-inspired mock environments. corridors that resembled park rides, gathering halls with artificial lighting that mimicked Main Street's perpetual twilight. These weren't for amusement, they were laboratories for testing the limits of human obedience. One whistleblower described a chilling exercise. Soldiers were placed in a replica town square, unaware that subliminal music was being played. The tunes shifted subtly from calm to anxious rhythms. Researchers observed how long it would take before order collapsed into disorder. The results were stark. Music alone was enough to fracture cohesion among trained troops. Another set of documents pointed to experiments in clone environments designed for riot suppression. Instead of using water cannons or rubber bullets, authorities tested psychological zones where projectors cast comforting imagery, while carefully engineered scents of food and home cooking drifted through the air. In trials, aggressive crowds became docile within minutes. It was control without visible coercion, and that made it all the more dangerous. But the most disturbing implication was not what NATO did, but what it planned. If populations could be conditioned to respond to environments the same way Disney guests did, then entire societies could be guided like park visitors. Borders, cities, even digital spaces could be Disneyfied into controlled environments. The Clone Project was no longer about creating a theme park, it was about turning the world itself into one. The deeper the military delved, the more obvious it became that Disney's underground experiments had built a new kind of weapon, not guns or bombs, but engineered obedience. And by the mid-2000s, rumors spread that these tactics were being exported across the Atlantic, where the US military was eager to adapt Disneyland's science of control for its own purposes. By the mid-2000s, the Clone Project had crossed the Atlantic. NATO's experiments had proven too valuable to remain confined to Europe, and American defense officials were quick to recognize the potential. In the shadow of 9/11, with Homeland Security elevated to a new priority, the United States military sought unconventional methods to control populations without overt displays of force. Disney's designs provided an almost perfect blueprint. At first, the influence appeared subtle. Training manuals for US Army psychological operations began to include case studies on architectural suggestion and environmental manipulation. Internal documents described these as non-lethal force multipliers, tools that could shape behavior without confrontation. To outside observers, it might have seemed benign, but beneath the surface, the techniques carried the DNA of the Disneyland Clone Project. The Department of Homeland Security took particular interest in the concept of flow control. If a theme park could prevent bottlenecks in a parade route, then airports, stadiums, and evacuation corridors could be designed the same way. By 2004, DHS had commissioned contractors, some with quiet ties to former Disney Imagineers, to retrofit major transportation hubs with hidden psychological triggers. Passengers moved more quickly through TSA checkpoints when exposed to certain lighting, scents, and soundscapes. Few noticed. Fewer questioned it. In the military sphere, experiments escalated. Training centers in the American Southwest constructed mock villages meant to simulate Middle Eastern towns. But these were no ordinary replicas. Embedded within them were hidden Clone Project technologies, color-coded pathways to guide movement, subliminal sound frequencies to induce compliance, even building layouts designed to foster predictability in crowd behavior. Reports suggested that troops trained in these artificial towns learned not only combat strategy, but also how to manipulate environments to pacify hostile populations. Perhaps most unsettling was the rise of behavioral infrastructure. City planning firms contracted by the Pentagon began experimenting with urban designs that mirrored Disneyland's illusions. Streets curved to subtly corral movement. Plazas were shaped to encourage surveillance. Public spaces pulsed with music carefully engineered to control tempo and mood. It was invisible architecture, a world where the built environment itself became the warden. Whistleblowers inside the defense industry began to speak of Disney labs for war. One former contractor described visiting a facility where walls shifted color in response to biometric readings. Another recalled being instructed to build false exits in a training environment, teaching soldiers how to corral crowds by denying them real escape routes. The line between theme park funhouse and military stronghold blurred until they were indistinguishable. By 2007, rumors swirled that parts of Baghdad had been restructured using clone project techniques. Entire neighborhoods were quietly reshaped with narrow walkways, looping routes, and psychological choke points. Civilians may not have known why they suddenly felt trapped or guided, but the architecture did, and that was the clone project's ultimate evolution: control without chains, obedience without awareness. The US military had turned Disneyland's art of illusion into a weapon, and while it began on foreign battlefields, it would not stay there. Soon, elements of this invisible system crept back into American soil, into cities that looked ordinary on the surface but were quietly designed to influence the people living inside them. What began as experiments under park asphalt and behind false storefronts eventually stepped out of the shadows and into everyday life. In the 2010s, as cities embraced connectivity and data, the techniques first refined inside Disneyland clones found a new medium: the smart city. Planners and tech companies sold a future in which urban life would be safer, cleaner, and more efficient. Sensor grids, adaptive lighting, real-time wayfinding, and predictive analytics. But beneath the marketing gloss, many of the tools looked remarkably like the Clone Project's playbook: architecture that channels movement, ambient cues that shape mood, and invisible feedback loops that nudge behavior without anyone noticing. The transition was incremental, almost innocent seeming. A city trials adaptive streetlights that dim when no one is around and brighten where crowds gather, efficient until the same algorithm is repurposed to funnel foot traffic away from protest routes. A transit agency deploys scent diffusers to make a concourse smell fresher and reduce complaints, helpful until the same vents are used to create calming aromas that lower agitation during mass gatherings. Private companies install analytics platforms to optimize retail layouts. Those platforms begin to predict where people will queue, where they will bottleneck, and how to reroute them. Less visible than a bollard, more effective. As smart city pilots multiplied in North America and Europe, old lessons were translated into new technologies. Cameras became smarter: facial feature mapping, gait analysis, micro-expression detection, tools that once existed only in control rooms beneath amusement facades. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth beacons tracked anonymized devices to measure dwell times. Aggregated heat maps looked a lot like Disneyland's crowd flow diagrams, only now they covered entire downtowns. Municipal dashboards promised better emergency response. What they also offered was the power to design human flow at city scale. Urban plazas, subway entrances, and concert venues were redesigned with behavioral heuristics in mind: sightlines that lead people where authorities wanted them to go, seating arrangements that disperse clusters, pavement textures that slow or speed footsteps. The language shifted from guest experience to citizen experience, but the intent was eerily familiar. Private contractors, some with alumni from theme park engineering teams, played a central role. They sold turnkey packages: sensors, city dashboards, ambient audio systems, scent diffusers, and machine learning models trained on millions of hours of movement data. Public-private partnerships smoothened the path. Vendors provided infrastructure, cities provided legitimacy, and defense-linked consulting firms provided the analytics. Transparency reports and privacy guarantees were drafted, but many of the most invasive systems were justified under emergency preparedness or commercial optimization. Once deployed, they blended into the civic fabric until they were considered normal. Smart city tech also standardized subtle manipulation tactics. Dynamic signage could display different messages depending on crowd density: come in friendly blue tones during peak hours, flick to neutral grays during demonstrations. Pavement wayfinding that once guided Disney guests now guided commuters toward particular exits, toward particular vendors, or away from sensitive zones. Ambient soundscapes, once evaluated in underground labs for their capacity to calm or energize, were piped into transit hubs to lower stress or hasten departures. Even the measured diffusion of retail scents migrated into municipal planning as a tool to influence mood. When you felt inexplicably calm walking from the subway to a public square, it might have been atmospheric engineering, not serendipity. What made the smart city adaptation especially insidious was scale and data fusion. Unlike a closed experiment with a few dozen subjects, cities could record millions of daily interactions. Machine learning models ingested CCTV, transit card swipes, mobile signals, and retail transactions to build predictive profiles of neighborhoods. Planners could simulate scenarios where a diverted crowd would go, how ascent would affect linger time, whether a soft melody could reduce agitation, and then deploy those nudges in real time. In practice, this meant the Clone Project's lessons were no longer isolated curiosities, but baked into the urban operating system. Civil rights groups raised alarms, privacy advocates pushed back, insisting on oversight, opt-out mechanisms, and public debate. Some cities rolled back the most aggressive measures, others doubled down, citing public safety or tourism revenue. Meanwhile, the tools kept improving. Edge AI meant faster interventions, more sophisticated sensors meant subtler nudges. The public, used to convenience and small comforts, slowly accepted many of these intrusions in exchange for perceived safety. The Disneyland Clone Project began with dreams of wonder, a corporate experiment meant to perfect the art of joy. But by the time its blueprints filtered through militaries, governments, and private contractors, it had morphed into something else entirely, an invisible architecture of obedience. Streets became stage sets, cities became parks, citizens became guests who never realized they'd bought a ticket. Yet, for all its sophistication, the system was never flawless. Whistleblowers described glitches, moments when the cues failed, when a crowd surged despite the music, when protesters tore down digital signage or mocked the scents pumped through vents. Resistance was messy, unpredictable, human. And unpredictability was the one thing the Clone Project had never been able to fully erase. By the late 2010s, cracks appeared. Smart city projects once celebrated as futuristic began drawing protests. Civil libertarians called them theme parks of control, and conspiracy forums claimed entire districts were nothing more than live laboratories. In some cases, the accusations weren't far from the truth. Documents leaked from European planning boards revealed contracts with defense-linked firms that openly referenced crowd pacification architecture. American cities, too, were quietly pressured by Homeland Security to deploy systems in transit hubs, stadiums, and public plazas. The more people discovered, the louder the backlash grew. But the most chilling question wasn't about where these systems had already been deployed. It was about where they were heading. With the rise of artificial intelligence, the Clone Project's logic was no longer dependent on static design. I could learn in real time, adjusting lighting, sound, and signage to micromanage crowds second by second. It was the dream Walt Disney had sketched in the 1960s, a city that thinks, a city that guides, only now stripped of its utopian veneer. In practice, it meant cities that could herd people like livestock, while residents mistook it for efficiency. Some urban designers warned that this was an irreversible path. Once populations grow accustomed to invisible nudges, rolling them back becomes nearly impossible. After all, who would vote against safer streets or faster commutes? Comfort was the Trojan horse, and obedience rode inside. What few recognized was how closely this echoed the parks themselves. People accepted limits on their freedom so long as the environment was pleasurable. The illusion of choice was always enough, and so, the Disneyland Clone Project never truly ended. It simply changed names, changed hands, and expanded its reach. Today, when you step into a gleaming new plaza and find yourself unconsciously drifting with the crowd, or when your phone nudges you toward a path you didn't mean to take, you are feeling the residue of those experiments. You are walking inside an echo of a park that pretended to be a city, and a city that pretended to be free. The project's true brilliance, and its true danger, was that it never needed force. It needed only design. It whispered through lights, sounds, scents, and layouts. It didn't command, it suggested. And suggestion, when scaled across millions, becomes indistinguishable from law. So, the next time you're in a space that feels too perfect, too clean, too managed, ask yourself, is this convenience or is it choreography? Is the city serving you, or are you playing a part in someone else's script? Because the Clone Project has always been less about Disney and more about the future. A future where control hides in plain sight, where freedom is traded for efficiency, and where the loudest sound in the city is not a protest, not a siren, not a crowd, but an echo. The Disneyland clone project didn't vanish when the rides ended. It slipped into airports, into stadiums, into the smart cities we now call home. The lights above you, the music around you, even the streets beneath your feet may already be whispering instructions you never agreed to follow. The question isn't whether you're inside the system, it's whether you can still see the walls of the park. If this investigation opened your eyes, don't let the story end here. Subscribe, share, and join us as we uncover more hidden blueprints of control, because the next chapter isn't waiting in history books. It's happening right now, outside your door.